meeting too. So anyway, thank you for coming, and I hope the stories will be interesting and funny, and there's some tragedy involved too. So, and we're going to focus mostly on the Twin Rock Valley area and Galanders Mountain. Galanders Mountain is, you know, the United Church is. That road goes up just when you pass the United Church.
Oh,
And Twin Rock Valley is where the road goes along the lake, and it goes out about 2 miles. So Galanders Mountain, Twin Rock Valley is kind of, at one time, it was kind of a community. And there was a school, well, actually the schoolhouse is on the historical, the site came from Twin Rock Valley. So we'll start, the first house when you go out the Twin Rock Valley Road is McMillan's. And Duncan McMillan, he came from the Isle of Mutt, Scotland. He sat on that farm. And then his two sons, the farm was divided. So the son in the inside was Lachlan, and the outer side is John. So we'll start with Lachlan. And if you have ever driven out Twin Rock Valley, you'll see the barn right by the road. It's a very unusual design, completely unusual, except different than any barn you see around here. It has this like the eaves come out and curve up like an arch, and it's completely for decoration. Like it serves no purpose, like for storing hay or that sort of thing. So I'd much recommend, if you haven't seen it, to drive out Twin Rock Valley Road. It's just on your left. It's right by the road. You can't miss it. And if you want to see the barn in its original state, the back of the barn still has the wooden shingles. You know, it looks like it would when it was first built. So
where is that road, Barry?
it's just up about where the main highway goes along the lake down here about a half a mile.
Yeah.
And the road goes to your right from here.
I thought that was the Galanders road.
No, the Galanders is just on this side. It's on the United Church. You know what the United Church is?
I'll have to have a look.
That's where the Galanders Mountain. They both go out east. And there's one little story about Lachlan McMillan that her mother used to tell. He told his wife, Laura, he said, will you go outside at night and look at the sky and see what kind of a day we're going to have tomorrow? And so Laura went out and looked at the sky and came back in. Oh, we're going to have a beautiful day, Lachlan, tomorrow. Absolutely no. He said to his wife after sending her outside. And another time, Flora was in the kitchen looking out the kitchen window. And it was winter time, and she said to Lachlan, "Oh, Lachlan, look at the beautiful big snowflakes coming up." And Lachlan said, "Well, if they're that beautiful, why don't you go out and sit under them?" And Malcolm Archie, he took over the farm, and it's him that I would say that built that farm that I was talking about. And the beautiful design, I'll just show you a watercolor I did. This is like a carriage house, it was called, you know, with the wagons. And this was beside the farm, it's still there. And a very unusual roof design. So I did this watercolor about 4 or 5 years ago. Sadly, in the last couple of years, this building just fell over, which is unfortunate. It was a really beautiful piece of architecture, unusual design. And our mother used to talk about living at Malcolm Marriage's, Jack Eves, I think he was from England, like what they call home children. He came maybe after the war, or even in that area. A lot of kids came to this area. But I guess even as a teenager, he was very skilled in carpentry. And our mother used to say Malcolm Archie he'd be so proud of what this kid was building. And I often think that maybe he had some hand in building this. And even the barn, you wonder where did they get this design? So it wasn't your normal straight, you know, maybe magazines or books that see these designs. And the last person to live on that farm, his name was Lockie Duncan. He'd be Malcolm Archie's son. And I used to visit Lockie Duncan in the evening. He'd go and visit him. And at that time, he was like 90-ish, you know, and still really smart and mentally smart. And I remember going there one evening, and he was sound asleep with his feet up in the oven, with the stove blazing away. And I just woke him up, you know, but it was like in a furnace. You know, his feet at the stove, like how he would survive. He was great conversation. It was really good to visit and get. But one thing is very interesting. He was a veteran of the First World War. I remember him telling his experiences. And plus I recorded some of it and made it articles. And he'd always make tea. And it was, you couldn't get more basic, a white store-bred jam and a donut. And I remember he'd say, "Oh, I love donuts." So his diet wasn't the best. So I remember him drinking tea. He'd take a sip. And then another sip. The hot tea was like putting energy in my head. So we'll move out to with the McPhails. They were further back in Twin Rock Village, and Hector McPhails. And the first settler there, his name was Malcolm McPhail. He started clearing land about 1855. At first, him and his wife lived with his brother, Colin McPhail. And they lived just over here, about a quarter mile. A German family owns the farm now. I'm not sure. They come there. I think the lady's husband has died.
Oh, yes.
You know.
Yes, I haven't been forgotten.
Yeah, so that's the farm where, and Malcolm and his wife lived with Colin and his wife. Like my next door neighbor, Andy McPhail, whose husband was one of these McPhails. It didn't seem that times were very happy. Well, the two wives, you know, the whole thing. So anyway, he got this land up in the valley and started clearing. And it's a beautiful setting where that farm is. It ended up just being called in Hector's because he was the last settler of it. It's in the Twin Rock Valley. It's the biggest problem was sunlight because one mountain was to the east and the other was to the west. So the sun was late rising and plus early setting, so they had trouble, say, drying hay this time of year and that sort of thing. And this Malcolm's son John took over the farm, and there was another son, John Edward, who had a farm further up the valley. So it was even more of a problem with sunlight and rocks, boulders all over. I don't even know how they ever plowed the land. And anyway, he ended up moving his house to North Lake Ainslie. And it's just next door to his brother, Hector. And Hector would be Tansy McPhail's grandfather. From the grandfather. And where Jan Edward lived, eventually Burton's lived there, Ernest Burton. But the house is, the last couple of years, it's been taken down. But one little story about Jan Edward. A lot of these stories our mother told, you know, she just think it's some little funny old story that she heard. But Jan Edward, people would be invested, and his wife's name was Sarah. But you'd be, like if they were having, the two, say with two men having a conversation, she'd be adding her 2 cents or interrupting. So Jan Edward said, "Go to bed, Sarah." And Sarah said, I'll preface in Gaelic, "I'll go to bed in the house, my head." And she said, "I'll go to bed when I please." She said to her husband. And coming up the valley, we come to what eventually became known as Johnny Patterson's. And Norman and Austin Patterson, we could have the stories, because that would be their old friend. But their grandmother's McKinnon, was them that cleared the land originally, and one of the daughters married Patterson. But with that particular household, Laughlin was the man that cleared the land. And it'd be around the same time the MacPhails started clearing the land, 1850s. And a lot of the family of Laughlin are what's called styled on him, like Neil Laughlin, but in Gaelic the L is pronounced like a W. So Wachan, you know, it's like the same like Ainslie, it's Wach. It's just the dialect in this part of the Gaelic dialect. But Laughlin had a daughter, Flora Wach. Everybody say it. Flora Wach. So anyway, there's going to be Flora Wachan's cave, and it belongs to the Historical Society here. It's over in the house. And I was with Edward Campbell one day. Edward would be Kathy's, DJ's wife's father. Well, he was father too. And we were looking at the cane, and Edward was, you can see it's charred on the end of the cane. Edward, he'd be teaching school, I assume, like at that time, he'd be or at the McKinnon's house. And he said every so often, Flora would be sitting by the stove and poke the cane and just to stir up the fire. And so that's why it's charred. Which I thought was really amazing, that to get that connection with this old cane, you know, it's burnt in. Like, that's why it's burnt. And Mary Unla, should be that. Earl Unla, yeah, his mother, she grew up in this area. And she should be out of these kids. And she remembered Flora Walken. And Mary said she had a big iron pot on the stove. I can still see it. It was a Johnny's, and the Johnny Patterson she referred to. She had it full of soup. It was in the winter. You'd go in there and she'd give you a bowl full. And I'd keep the soup going day after day. I'd just keep adding water to it and ingredients. And the same with porridge, like oatmeal porridge that had a pot going all week. And it was pretty basic. So let's see, the diet, there was no big variety. But Flora Walken, I remember talking to Wayne's mother, Mary, one time. She was at my studio. And we were talking about Flora Walken, you know, just old stories, because Mary taught school there too, in that area. And then I showed Mary some old pictures. There was a group of people out at the mill, and this old lady was sitting over the cane, and I asked Mary, like, who is this lady? Well, that's the lady you were just talking about. Laura Walker, but I was really pleased. I actually had a picture of her, you know, but she was such a matron. You hesitate to use the word character, because I'm sure we're all characters, you know. You know, like, and they were so, they had this amazing wit to it. Somebody's, you know, really, sometimes really cutting wit. And Janetti McMillan, he lived in the next firm. So to see him coming in the evening with the lantern to visit Johnny Patterson, but to play cards with John. And Flora Walken would say, well, all we'll hear now for the rest of the night is 15-2, 15-2. It was not, there was no answer. But she had the saying, if somebody would come in, smooth that, which means spit it out. She wanted the news. So she, you know, start telling your news. And another story, Ada, would be Norman and Austin's mother. She came from England. And Bradley was her last name. And Delina McGinnis, she lived down the road with either. Her and her mother were visiting. And this was after Ada came, and this Flora Walken said, we have a new little girl in the house here, Ada Brittley. And Ada said, it's not Brittley, it's Bradley. And the old lady said, Brittley no Bradley, Hemicona, which means I don't care. But I was also asking Ada, and then there was another lady, Annie Tate, she lived in Lake McKinnon, the next firm. That's where Annie lived. They were from England. And Annie's brother Jack, they were Butterworth was their last name. If I asked my mother about their Gaelic, did they, you know, house it? She said no, they learned, and they had good Gaelic. You know, from England, you think, but she said that was the language of the household. You know, they had to learn it, you know. And a lot of these kids came when they were 6, 10 years old, you know. And they became very fluent in Gaelic. And then another, just again with the Wayne's mother Mary, she was talking about, I guess, should say a month in each house. That's the way the school system was run at that time. Like the community would pay, but each household had a responsibility to keep the teacher for a month. And I remember Mary talking about being at the game back at the McPhails, and Alan McPhail used to play the violin in like in the evening. His mother would say, oh, isn't that nice? And Mary said she was so proud of Malcolm playing his tunes on the violin. So we're going to jump across to the Glanders Mountain, and that's where the McKay family lived. And Archibald McKay was the first settler there. And they were the same McKays as, well, later to Janeway and again to Angus McKay. And there were 2 brothers came. There was a 3rd brother up at Hadley, near where you folks live. And when Archibald first came, you know, clearing the land, they'd have a bonfire out in the pasture. Because at that time, bears were a problem. Well, one thing, all of a sudden, there was so much forest being cleared. As one fellow said, if you want to talk about clear cutting, you know, like hundreds of thousands of years or so, and all of a sudden they're just leveling all this forest. And so these animals were getting displaced, like bear and whatever. So there were a problem first with settlers, and they built a bonfire. I mean, this Archibald, just to keep any bears away if they were like out, if the people were out milking the cows. But anyway, Archibald had a pig, And one evening the bear got the pig, and he was dragging the pig over the fence. And Archibald ran, and him and the bear fighting over the pig. And Archibald won. He got the pig free from the bear. It was Isabel McMillan that he always said, was telling me there was no way he was going to lose his, winter meat. It's just hard. Bear, no bear. Yeah. And Archibald had a daughter, Mary Gillespie, Mary, the daughter of Archibald in Gaelic. And she used to she'd come into my house like for maybe 3 or 4 days. And Charles Neil McLean, Kimberly's grandmother, Polly's grandfather, and Polly's father-in-law. He remembered as a kid Mary Gillespie coming in to help his mother make marrocks and pudding, stuff like that, and then hang it up in the attic for the winter, or maybe help with knitting, whatever, like the family, because like that particular family had a lot of kids, and they needed some help. But Charles Steele would take her home in the horse and wagon, and then in the fall he always would go out. He was just basically a kid, but he always knew that his Mary Gillespie would have a pair of mitts for him. She'd knit, And one Archibald's daughter, Marcella, she had a son, James, and this story Katie Merrigan McPhail told me. She lived up at the McPhail firm that I mentioned before. And plus she lived next door to me for a while. And the day that James got married, the problem was that his bride-to-be was Catholic. So, and she was from Piper's Glen, Mackenzie, I don't know, remember, Jeanette Mackenzie, counselor, could be his granddad, I guess. But anyway, getting married, and Ruth McMillan, they were at the house up in the Landers Mountain, getting dinner ready, because the girl from Piper's Glen had eloped or snuck away from home to get married to this James. And so Katie Margaret, they were preparing a dinner for the wedding party when we were coming back. It was at the manse up near the Presbyterian Church where they were getting married. And who burst in the door but Marcella's father. And just in a rage, Katie Margaret said, that where's my daughter Marcella? Like this, he was not going to permit this wedding to go, and Katie Margaret, they said it's too late. They're up at the man's getting married right now, and he had a cane. Katie Margaret said, have pots like on the stove cooking. He just took cane and swiped all the pots and everything across the kitchen. But and James and Marcella eventually, they had 2 daughters, but she died quite young, Marcella, very, just in her 40s, she was very young woman. And as far as I know, they did make like a peace with them all. And James, he remarried to over Kenmouth, to a college, so just when you turn, like the terminus start to that's where, well, some of them are tied in with the Shaws that live there now, like Jimmy Shaw. He was just, I guess, his mother would be connected with that James. So for the next story, and this will be the last story, but I'm going to incorporate some art and sketching. bear with me here a minute. And this is about the Macmillan family that I kind of skipped over them. They lived just, well, Huey and Isabel, Janetti Macmillan, this Macmillan family lived just right below. They were the same Macmillan. And I call this story Convergence. So the central figure in this story is Neil McMillan and his parents, Maggie and Huey McMillan. They were the last to live in the old house that was in the And actually, the house wasn't all that old. It was built in 1820. The other house before it had burned. It was the family built this beautiful big house. Today it would cost a fortune. All hardwood flooring, Douglas fir, like ceilings and walls and pine. And the old folks lived. Well, it'd be Pine's mother-in-law Vera lived there. Grew up in that house, and only about 20 years the house was, and then it became vacant. And today it's just falling down basically. So again, the story, we're going to focus on Neil McMillan. Neil grew up in Twin Rock Valley. He just like a normal kid out there. Jessie McKenzie from River Dennis. Her mother grew up in Twin Rock Valley. And her mother, she remembered Neil, like at that time, Jessie's mother was just a little girl. And she really liked Neil. One thing, at that time, when she remembered, he was working in the barite mine back in Scottsville. And every evening she'd have a little glass of cream, and there was a well house. Remember Alexander? And it's super cold water in that well. I mean, it's still there in the spring. She'd put the little glass of water in the well house, and then home from work, Neil would stop, and he knew this was going to be there for him. So the first sketch is this Neil. Bear with this. It will come together. Again, I call this convergence. The story involves four men. Neil from Twin Rock Valley, Canada. Another fellow, William Angle from Iowa, in the United States. James O'Brien from Ireland. And Johann Schmidt from Germany. And one fateful night, these four men met in Seattle, Washington. So that's where our story is supposed to be. went away, he was a policeman in Vancouver, Canada. And then he transferred to Seattle, where he became a policeman there. And like growing up in Twin Rock Valley, he'd be involved in well, say sports, like playing baseball was the big thing in that era, and wrestling, like just different games that have. I remember this is in we came with the Fails. My granddaunt Hannah was her name, and John Rory was his name. McPhail was wrestling with one of the McKinnons that became ministers and doctors in Canada. And the McPhail fellow was winning, but then Hannah was the first cousin to the McKinnon fellow, and she didn't like this. That her cousin was losing. So John Rory had his pair of pants. He had a rope around, tied, like instead of a belt. So Hannah snuck up behind him and loosened what was holding his pants up. So his pants started falling down, and then he had to stop wrestling with the McKinnon fellow. And then the McKinnon fellow got ahead of him. And Hannah was happy. She wrestled. So, I remember Archie McPhail, when he was a kid. Archie was born in 1900. He remembered in church this McMillan family pond. And he said one of them was all dressed in like a military, but he said big shiny buttons. And I well believe it might have been his Neil home. But none of the other members of the family had what that sort of work. So this is charcoal. So the next in this story is William Angle from Muscatine, Iowa. I'm not sure what exactly that is. Okay, so this would be William Angle. He was a veteran of the First World War, and just young. This was 1921 when the story taking place, so the war was over in 1918. And just recently married. And he went through major battles in France, Mileheul. And Arbonne or the Sorbonne. Sorbonne, like there was two major battles in France, and he went through both battles without a scratch. And then came home.
What year was this Neil born?
Well, I'd say about 1890. Just touching, he was, I think, around 30 when this happened. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Duncan McMillan, the high school up in Sherbrooke. But that Dr. Duncan would be his Neil's brother. But there was, remember? Tragedy in the family. Neil had a brother, Albert, who died of appendicitis in his 20s. Another brother, Jimmy, who was out in Ontario and drowned. He was in the prospecting or something like that. And another brother, possibly Angus, died during that influenza. Spanish flu. So the one family, there was a lot of heritage. So just a kind of this is in there. You're doing like a group picture like this. What's called contour. Contour is basically the line. So something like this. Like you try to tie the whole thing together. So you use these lines. Visually, it ties the whole thing together. So that's what. I'm trying to do. So, and the next person in it's James O'Brien. As I mentioned, James O'Brien was from Ireland. I think he had 5 children, James O'Brien. So these 3 men all were members of the Seattle Police Force.
my office. Can you draw? Yeah, can you draw?
I can use a ruler. So the last, person in our, in this group will be Johann Schmidt from Germany.
Maybe there's more to the story with the king and Barrie, maybe she was the draw with him. There's a charcoal on the end of it.
I know, and, one thing is remarkable about this story is that this William Angle, for example, would go through the war, these major battles, fighting German soldiers, basically. Come back, go to Seattle, and meet up with this, our next fellow here, from, and it's just recently an immigrant from Germany.
Do you always start with the eye, Barry?
No, well, I do, but one reason I'm doing it here is so that you can actually quickly see if it's, like it's a person or something, you know. I started down here, so people, what? At least with the eye, I know it's going to be a person.
One.
And this,
Johnny.
Johann Schmidt, he grew up in Germany. I think his grandfather raised him. And he'd be in his early 20s. But it's not likely he was involved himself in the war. He'd be a teenager. He could have been, maybe, you know, some teenage group or something. So again, with doing a group like this, again, you're trying to, from an artistic viewpoint, trying to tie this all together with line and tone. Let's say this white area here, you might put something in there just to. Yeah, well, no, that's it for,
It's amazing.
thank you.
Can we ask questions now?
Until this. The story.
I'm not like whacking my head.
Okay, so we'll get down to January 21st, 1921, Friday evening. And Neil McMillan, it was his first night on duty. And this William Angle was, it was not showing him around the beat or all the different things that a policeman had to, like it was at that time telephones to report back to the station. What it would murder and what it would do. So they rang in and reported back to headquarters. As they were walking down Broadway Street, they saw a man coming towards them who was this Johann Schmidt. And Angle said, "This is a suspicious looking fellow. We better shake him down." And Neil said, "I guess he's just a working fellow." So Neil went over and he went to, there was a door to a shop. He just went over to rattle it to see that it was locked. And he had his back to Neil McMillan and Schmidt. But all of a sudden, Schmidt pulled out an automatic revolver and shot an Angle. An Angle fell to the sidewalk. And Neil McMillan, still in the doorway, with his back to him, but 10 feet away, was really startled by the gunshots. And as he swung around, he saw the man, gun in hand, standing over him, but he had no time to react. The man pointed the pistol at Neil McMillan and shot him. Two shots, and Neil collapsed to the pavement. He managed to raise himself and fire twice at the bandit, who was now in flight, but both shots missed the mark. Neil fell back to the ground helpless. The man fled across the street into a nearby muddy, vacant lot and disappeared behind an apartment. Two different motorists passing the scene stopped and sped the injured policeman to the hospital. They were still living at that time. The Central Station was informed of the shootings, and description of the bandit was given. He was described as being short and stocky and wearing a red Mackinaw coat and a white-colored hat. And then 1 hour passed. Detectives T.J. Montgomery and Miss James O'Brien were standing in the vestibule of King Brothers Haberdashery, and these are streets in Seattle, at 2nd Avenue and Cherry Street. And a young man named Dean Kerman, who knew both men, stopped to chat. Kerman was standing between the two officers. And O'Brien reached across his back to the visitor, and he tapped his fellow policeman on his shoulder and said, "Look who's coming," indicating a man walking down 2nd Avenue with both hands in his Mackinaw pockets. "Yes, he looks like it. And look at the mud in his shoes." So they said this, they were sure this was Schmidt, the guy that had shot the two policemen. So the two policemen stepped out from the vestibule onto the street and advanced towards the pedestrian. O'Brien reached out his left arm, threw it across the man's waist, and grabbed him by the sleeve and said, "Just a minute, stop, we are police officers." But before any more could be said, the man jerked himself free from the detectives. He drew his pistol and started firing. As soon as he did so, O'Brien also drew his weapon and started shooting. O'Brien managed to hit the bandit twice, but on the second shot fired by the bandit, Detective O'Brien went down. The bullet passed through his heart. His gun fell from his grip. He attempted to crawl on his hands and knees to reach the revolver, which lay about 4 feet from him. He collapsed on his stomach before reaching it. The other, Detective Montgomery, drew his revolver as quickly as possible and started shooting towards Schmidt. Store windows shattered from the flying bullets. Montgomery had 1 bullet left in his gun. He knew that he had to get the bandit with the last shot, so he took careful aim. The man dropped, the bullet catching him in the groin, but he staggered up again. made a dive for him and attacked him with his fists. The first blow he dealt sent the man to the street. Montgomery wrestled the pistol from him. The second smash to the left side. The bandit's head knocked him unconscious. Montgomery ran out on the street to hail a passing car to get his comrade to the hospital. The wounded officer was lifted into the car, but Inspector O'Brien didn't make it. He died in the arms of a man on the way to the hospital. The following morning at the same hospital, William Angle was strong enough to give an account of the events that led to him McNeil McMillan getting shot. By 10 p.m., though, his condition became critical, and at 11:45 p.m. he died. And this is at Schmidt's arraignment. Said that he was 26, at the time it was John Smith, that he was 26-year-old. But further interrogation revealed his true name to be Johann Schmidt, an immigrant from Germany. At Monday, at 12:10 p.m., Schmidt was taken to court for arraignment. Holding his head in his hands, his left eye blackened. Johann Schmidt stood before Judge J.T. Long. You are charged with first-degree murder, said the judge. Do you understand that? Yes, sir, Schmidt replied. And addressing a lawyer standing with a group of people in the courtroom, Judge Ronald said, Mr. Sylvain, talking to the lawyer, would you take this young man's case? Sylvain nodded as he was. At the same time as Johann Schmidt was being arraigned in court, Neil McMillan was fighting for his life at Meyer Hospital. At 11 a.m., he suddenly took a turn for the worse. He steadily went downhill and died at 1:50 p.m. with his close friend patrolman S.J. Brady at his bedside. The funeral arrangements were made for James O'Brien and William Angle, that were planned for Tuesday of that week. But as soon as they heard that McMillan had died, plans were changed to include him in the ceremonies. James O'Brien, as I mentioned, was a native of Ireland and came to the United States when 20 years old. He lived in Seattle several years before joining the police department. William Angle was 26 years old and from Muscatine, Iowa. As I mentioned, he was a World War I veteran and gone without a scratch through the battles of St. Ohio and Moose, Arizona. And as mentioned, Neil was from just out here at Twin Oak Valley. At 10:15 a.m., this is the funeral. The two hearses bearing the bodies of William Angle and Neil McMillan drew up beside the curb near 4th Avenue and Nestler Way in downtown Seattle. At 11:30, the hearse carrying the body of James O'Brien joined the two hearses. The signal was given for a mile-long procession to begin. Motorcycle policemen sped ahead and cleared the way to the corner of 2nd Street in Nestler. A squad of police officers on horseback filed in behind the motorcycle. The roll of snare drums filled the Seattle air as the policemen emerged in behind the horsemen. James O'Brien's body was taken afterwards to Calgary Cemetery for burial. William Angle was laid to rest in Lakeview Cemetery. Neil McMillan's body was started on its long journey to his child's home in Nova Scotia. And Johann Schmidt's trial on Thursday, January 27, was brief. Attorney Louis Sylvain, only plea for his client was, God Almighty put the breath of life into this young man's body. God Almighty has the right to take it away. At 4:05, the jury retired. 50 minutes later, the customary knock was heard on the jury room door, indicating the jury was ready to come out. The jury found Schmidt guilty as charged and recommended to be executed by hanging. On Friday morning, April 1st, 1921, he was led from his cell in Walla Walla Penitentiary to the gallows. And as I mentioned, Neil McMillan, his body, he started its monitor back to his local truck owner, his name was Jack Monroe, met at Orangedale. He took the coffin and started to extra $200,000. And again, it's Charles Neal, Pauline's father-in-law, was a young man at the time. And he remembered there was blizzard snow, and the truck going up the hill at the lucky down to McMillan's, and right before it got stuck, and every so often it had to be shoveling, trying to get this body out of Twin Rock Valley. And in the cemetery, he's a nice stone with his name on up here in the cemetery. And another Seattle policeman just lost his life in a gun battle with bandits only a week before McMillan and the bride was shot. Losing these four brother officers within 1 week had a profound effect on the rest of the force. Captain Charles Tand, head of the city detective department, spoke about police officers assumed they are for hire, protecting the lives and property of the public. But he added, they are also humans who love life as strong as to other lives. So, that is the end of the story. Thank you.
Did anything come out of the trial while they do all that? Did anything come out of the trial while why that young fellow would do all that?
No, it's just, it's one of those situations where all of a sudden somebody feels they can just start blood similar to this story 2 years ago. For no reason.
It was crazy.
He had a gun, and one thing, a lot of this account comes from newspaper articles at the time, mentioned that Schmidt had a set of really rotten teeth, that was one thing that really stood out about him.
Oh. Yeah, it might have had some kind of.
Well, you never know. Or even why a person would, even it might have something to do with the war, too.
Yeah, he could have PTSD or anything, who knows?
Well, I don't think he'd be involved himself. He'd be only a kid for the Warriors, like in his teens.
Well, in 1921, you said he's in his 20s, so he could have.
Yeah, oh no, likely, possibly. But it's quite something that he would immigrate to the United States.
Yeah.
And end up, not even connected with war, shooting his policemen.
Where did all these shootings take place?
Yeah, Washington. No, it's like it's so much in the news today, gun violence, but it certainly was not. It was very prevalent even in that area.
Especially out west in the States.
Yeah.
In that time frame. Even before that.
Yeah. No, it was, but even for this Schmidt, to have an automatic pistol, he had to get it somewhere in the United States when he came. He certainly had to have it coming from Germany. Or what his intentions were having a pistol. It obviously was.
Well, he obviously wasn't wise to pull it down on two cops, so there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, like he just didn't.
He had a death wish.
Yeah. And plus, when the angle, which maybe he probably grabbed it and just They likely would have searched him.
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah.
So, we're having a cup of tea, I guess.
Well, you're sorry, though.